You're gonna make me like break the silence and welcome everybody. For those that are just joining us, we were talking about awkward it is to kill the like first minute or two while we wait for people to flood in, and clearly I'm impatient enough to where I felt like I needed to talk.
Well, Justin said he hated doing it, so we told him he had to, and he said he would run away, but then he ended up doing it anyway, so.
Yeah. Kick out this called the comedy styles of Justin Kohler. Big round of applause.
Uh, it's awful. I'm gonna start at like 1 minute past. Like housekeeping stuff, this will all be recorded and released. Slides will be available. We're going to throw a bunch of links and stuff in the chat. Ask us questions. We're going to be trying to answer them actually as we go. So I'll be watching Q&A while Will and Lee speak amazing things. So ask questions if you have them, and shout out and say hi. Where are you from? Watching from? Most of us are from the Seattle area, I guess, and then Rohan's from.
Oh, really? Are you in
Yeah.
Seattle, Justin?
Well, close enough.
I'm on the West Coast.
Yeah,
Washington State counts as Seattle, right?
exactly. Close enough to deal with the traffic.
Yeah. I think we're probably good to, I think it's two paths, probably good to
Yeah.
go.
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. We're excited to have everybody here today. Welcome to this webinar. It's titled, Putting NTLM in the Doghouse, the journey of modeling NTLM relay and authentication coercion attacks in BloodHound. So we're going to talk a lot about NTLM relay today and how we were able to add that into BloodHound. So for those who are unaware, my name is Lee Chigoya Christensen. I work on the research team here at SpectraOps. But I have a background in red teaming and penetration testing, and that's kind of influenced a bunch of the research I've done in years. Joining me today is Rohan, Will, and Justin. So Will?
Yeah. My name's Will Schroeder. I'm Harmjoy on Twitter and GitHub and all the socials. I'm one of the co-founders of BloodHound way back in the day, I guess now, along with Rohan. And I'm on the research team as well with Lee. So we kind of helped. We both did kind of some of the initial NTLM modeling and kind of the research side of some of this that I'll go over.
Yeah, and I'm Rohan Vazirker. I'm one of the senior developers on the BloodHound Enterprise team, and I was the person leading the initiative to bring the NTLM work into BloodHound. So very familiar with most of this work. Like Will said, one of the original writers of the BloodHound project. You can find me at Captain Jesus on Twitter.
I'm Justin Kohler. I lead the Bloodhound and Bloodhound Enterprise teams at SpectraOps. I have a Twitter that probably most people don't follow me, but at Justin Kohler 10 if you're curious.
Great. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, we're going to take our little NTLM doggo on a journey. First, we're going to talk about, just the new stuff that we've added. Then dive into the background behind why we added it, some of the details around NTLM relays, what they are and how we abuse them. Some of the research and modeling that we did to add this into BloodHound. And then talk a little bit about what we've seen since in the wild since we enabled this in some of our customer environments, as well as some of the lessons learned we've kind of learned along the way. So just a little summary. So this is just kind of showing off everything that we have so far. So what this whole effort did is it added 4 new edges into BloodHound. And these edges are due to some common attack primitives that we use on our own assessments, and we see that environments are vulnerable to. And those primitives are authentication coercion and NTLM relay. And so these 4 edges that we added use both of these techniques to coerce and relay to SMB ADCS, LDAP, and LDAP-S. So it's basically attacking different protocols, and we can abuse them in a variety of different ways. And we'll kind of show how that looks a little bit later on. In general, this is like, it's a very powerful combination because it allows authenticated users here to get access to another. It's very useful and primitive because anybody in the domain can do it. And I say useful as coming from an attacker perspective. Remember, I have this red teaming background, so I view this as very useful. Like, I can escalate my privileges or get access to another host or maybe compromise another user. But from a defensive perspective, this will also highlight, what could any user in the environment potentially do. And so we're really excited to have this in the product now too, to help out defensive teams. So we've added these 4 edges. Along with these 4 edges are some new collection collection options. These options are web client service, LDAP services, SMB info, and NTLM registry. And these will collect all the required info in order to enumerate this for environments. It's also worth noting that this is all collectible as a low privileged user. There's a little bit of a caveat on that. The behavior changes. We make some assumptions if we can't collect the registry data on a host. This primarily has to do with NTLM restrictions, outbound restrictions, but we make some assumptions that I'll talk about later. Discuss that.
Yeah, but first we're going to talk. Yeah, going to talk about a little bit of background on NTLM Relay. Like, why did we decide to model NTLM Relay? So on the research team, we have a lot of efforts that we tend to go after, a lot of different things different projects and just different subject areas that we want to dive into. So it comes down to prioritization. Like, why did we decide to spend an amount of time on this? So the real answer is kind of intuition. I would say, kind of informed intuition. If we were to formalize this, we would probably, the closest thing would be kind of the Rice scoring model for prioritization. So we don't use it formally, but if we were going to quantify our intuition as probably the closest thing, where you're going to look at the reach of an effort, times the impact of what that effort would be, times the confidence that you can actually achieve it, divided by the amount of effort. So, like, for example, kind of from the reach for this, kind of intuitively, we do a lot of assessment work at SpectropOps. We see a lot of different environments, and our work across a large number of corporate, very large corporate environments shows that these relay attack paths are pretty prevalent. They're used pretty heavily in a lot of our assessments. There's also a very ripe set of targets. So there's a lot of impact with Active Directory certificate services, which is one of the primitives that we're going to talk about. LDAP and LDAP-S is another one. But expanding beyond that, we didn't model everything. This is kind of a start. So there's potentially SCCM, MS SQL, like any number of other applications that use NTLM authentication in the environment. And also, our current assessment operator workflows weren't ideal. So again, Lee and I come from a red teaming background. So, we're always thinking about, the poor operators and all the tools they have to use and how terrible they are, the exact collection they have to do and how messy it is. So there's lots of just different pieces and ways that people would collect a lot of these things kind of piecemeal. And there wasn't a way to collect the data in mass and then visualize all of these attack paths kind of in a central place. Hence, BloodHound kind of makes sense for that. And then obviously from the defensive side too, we care about being able to model those things and be able to actually kind of cut them off. And finally, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, if we can add the capability into BloodHound, like, that's something we prefer. Personally, as somebody who uses BloodHound a fair bit, like, not having to go to another tool to try and collect this data is great. And just having it in the same interface just makes my own cognitive load lower, and makes assessing an environment easier.
And finally, kind of the plumbing we put in for this, very similar to like ADCS. So like the ADCS effort, there was a lot of plumbing and like post-processing edges and these types of things that made work like this possible. So some of the additional expansions of the underlying mechanics for actually implementing this is going to make it possible to more easily model other future attack primitives. So the next question you probably have, or I know a lot of people have, is it Microsoft killing NTLM? Right? There's all these news articles. Microsoft's going to kill NTLM. You're like, it's going to be gone. Blah blah blah. If you pay attention, they've been saying these articles for the past what 3 or 4 years, Lee, something like that. I don't know how long it's been, and then it seems like the goalpost keeps moving. The ball keeps getting kicked down the road. Because like our little meme has, there's a big difference between mostly dead and all dead because mostly dead is still slightly alive. Part of that is legacy systems, which is always the Achilles heel for Microsoft environments and kind of Microsoft themselves, to where if there's an environment that has mission critical systems that are, just something really, really necessary for a business process, and say it uses NTLM in the background, or in like it's an older system that they can't possibly upgrade and things like that. So NTLM was so prevalent for so many decades that it is very difficult to try to completely eliminate it from an environment. I don't know of any environment that just like completely disabled NTLM successfully. IA Curb, which is the initial and pass-through authentication using Kerberos. It's a new like kind of authentication component that Microsoft is developing for Windows 11 and the newer versions of Server. It's been mentioned 3 to 4 years ago, I think, is when I first started hearing about it in the planning stages. Is not enabled yet. We keep waiting for it. So that's going to be one of the things that helps kill NTLM, but it's not even out yet. And NTLM is still enabled by default. They're starting to, it's a big step to give Microsoft some props. They are deprecating it in newer versions of Windows 11, and is it Server, whatever the newest version of Server is, Lee, whatever it is, they're starting to deprecate as well.
2025?
Correct? Yeah, I believe so. But NTLM V1 is removed, but for V2, which is what we're talking about here, it will be removed from Windows Server in a future release, but it is not yet. So this is a very difficult problem to kill NTLM. So I just want to say, we're picking on Microsoft a little bit, but we understand why it's such a challenging problem. Our main argument with this is just saying why we chose to model this is we believe NTLM attacks will be around for a while. Like over time, they will start to decrease in number as more and more modern systems get updated and things get deprecated and disabled, but we don't think they're going away anytime soon.
By soon,
I'd
you
say-
like plus or minus, like put some money on under or over
Ooh.
10 years, Will.
I would say maybe for most I think NTLM will still be around in most environments to some degree in 10 years, but I think we'll see a pretty steep drop off between the 5 and 10 year standpoint for most environments, but I think there's still going to be some around. And as long as it's, enabled for a couple of servers, right, in a way that we can abuse, that we might be able to pop those servers, like it doesn't have to be disabled everywhere. As long as it's still there for some interesting servers with some interesting people logged on, it can still be useful offensively.
Yeah, I mean, it took how many years for people to get rid of Windows 7 in their environments? And
Mhm.
that wasn't even like a core protocol of the entire
Yeah.
thing. So
So
Yeah,
XP
let's
is
have the
definitely not hanging around in any environment still.
yeah,
yeah, we can
the-
have a betting pool going that we can just have a collective company betting pool for when NTLM will actually die.
I'd ask the attendees here to chime in if they still have Windows 7 running in their environment, but I wouldn't expect anybody to volunteer that.
Yeah.
Just to add on to that, something too that's a big common problem that we see is like NTLM is a much simpler protocol than Kerberos, and so a lot of like appliances or Linux devices or non-Windows software, if they need to integrate with Active Directory, they'll choose to implement NTLM for authentication rather than Kerberos, just because NTLM is a much simpler protocol. And as a result of that, like this kind of it ties in with the legacy. Like all of these old systems have to migrate to using Kerberos or supporting Kerberos to some extent if they want to still work with Active Directory, and that's just going to take time. So it's going to keep things working for quite a bit.
So this will be pretty brief, but just in case you aren't super familiar with NTLM, NTLM authenticates users through it's just a fairly basic challenge response mechanism. There's basically 3 messages. The first would be negotiate, where a client will say to a server, "Hey, I want to start, I want to start the authentication process. Here's my negotiate message." The server will send a challenge value back to the client, and the client will send that challenge back in an authenticate message encrypted with their key. So this is just very, very high level, very, very big deal. It's just our very big idea. It's just challenge response. It's fairly basic. I won't go into, there's lots of good online resources that go into all the exact mechanics of it. From NTLM Relay, in a simple kind of scenario, again, there's lots of different mitigations and things that Lee is going to talk about with some of the edges. But basically, all an attacker has to do is let the victim operate as normal, and they're going to pass those messages and replies through between the victim and the target. Pass that negotiate through, pass the challenge and the response through and everything. And then after the entire flow finishes, the attacker-controlled host is actually going to have that authenticated session to the target. So if the attacker can convince the client to basically authenticate to them, then they can relay that NTLM authentication to a target that that victim has access to. So then the attacker can subsume that access. So again, there's lots of subtleties here. There's lots of caveats, and Lee will dive into a chunk of those for some of these edges. But this is the general conceptual idea. And
I'd
there's
say
kind of, sorry, go ahead.
one of this component here for NTLM relay, the attacker does need to be in some man in the middle position. And while that may seem like a big hurdle, in reality, it's not too big of a challenge when we come to exploiting this due to this next component that we're
Yep.
gonna talk about.
So that's the first component we need is, that's for these edges, how we're building them. The second one is coerced computer authentication. So this is actually a class of attacks that Lee was actually the inventor of or the discoverer of. He kind of came up with the first example of this. But the general idea is if you're an attacker-controlled host, like compromised, through a number of different methods, you can request a server to connect to you or somewhere else using NTLM authentication. And you can do this when you're not privileged. So like a low privilege user or computer and compromised can force a server to authenticate to a target of the attacker's choice without having administrative rights on that server, which is pretty crazy when you think about it, that this is possible. Microsoft does not treat this as a security boundary by default correctly. Like this is not just by core nature of this. If you're in a stock domain and you're able to force a server to authenticate somewhere else, unless you have certain other things configured, that's not technically a vulnerability that allows domain escalation, but it's a primitive that we've used for like 10 years now to compromise large number of places because in a realistic environment, this is going to play into some misconfigurations that allows this abuse. So some of the examples, the very first one that Lee came up with was an abuse of the print system remote protocol. It was a tool called spool sample. One of the most popular ones that kind of came out was called Petit Patam, which abuses the encrypting file system remote protocol. The big one with Petit Patam is you could do it unauthenticated. So if you weren't even authenticated to the domain. So Microsoft did patch just that component, but they haven't patched just the native, like inherent, you can force a computer to coerce it to authenticate somewhere else. There's also a tool called Coercer, which is kind of the clearinghouse for like several different methods, a lot of these different protocols. So again, big points here is a low privilege user can do this. And in the model that we're going to present, we assume this is possible in an environment because 99% of the time we've been able to do it in most places. Also, just kind of as a side note, there's another element to NTLM relay, which is kind of passive authentication. So we do not model this in BloodHound, and I'll explain why in a second. But with this, normally, let's say you have an attacker-controlled host, and you wait for like a vulnerability scanning account to come in at midnight or something like that. And if it's using NTLM, maybe you might be able to relay that account somewhere else. This is something lots of people have done over the years, for the past like 10, 20 years. Just wait, and if periodically it comes in, maybe you might be able to relay it somewhere else. The reason we don't model this currently in BloodHound is that in order to gather this information, you need event logs from either every affected host that's being authenticated to, every workstation, or from every domain controller. You need the, is it the 4624 logs from the DC, like from with the NTLM authentication package? Because these logs will exist in the host being authenticated to, or the domain controller itself where the NTLM is relayed to. So you can't just like collect this traditionally how we've generally collected stuff through SharpHound. You have to do a remote event log collection. And this is surprisingly difficult to do without spiking resources on remote servers. So it's something we're still investigating. But if you want to collect it remotely from a DC, it tends to spike resources, or otherwise you would have to have code running on every server or every workstation or every DC, so you need some kind of agent. So that's the reason why we kind of punted this down the road, and I'll talk about those scenarios here in a second. So when Lee and I started brainstorming all of this, we spent, was it 2 to 3 weeks, Lee, through like multiple things in the office. These are actual pictures of our whiteboards. There's probably like
This
5 to 7
Will.
versions. Yeah. This is we have the Pepe Sylvia meme to where there was so many different versions that we went through. And then finally the big breakthrough, there's some particular breakthroughs that Elad Shamir, the director for the research group, was chatting with us and he was like, "Oh yeah, why don't you just do this?" And it kind of made everything snap into place. So doing the modeling side is can end up being very difficult for some of these problems because there's just a lot of subtleties and caveats. And then there's a lot of things of, will this blow up the graph? Will this have, n squared, like the number of edges or something like that? So there's the modeling part is very fun, but it can be more challenging than you might think.
Yeah. In terms of like the research process, this is the hardest part.
But this next slide, this shows kind of the model, the general model of the 6 different attacks that we came up with and we're going to talk about all these scenarios in depth. I won't go through all of them here, but there's basically TLDR, there's 3 coercion scenarios that we have implemented in BloodHound. And then there's the 3 passive collection scenarios that we have not. So Lean hit the little X guy. And again, we just kind of punted this down the road. These passive collection scenarios are basically they're related to each coercion scenario. Like you have coerce and relay to LDAP or like relay to LDAP, right? So it's either you're coercing a system to you or you're just sitting on a system and waiting for something to connect. So all the plumbing is there from the modeling side for us to be able to implement this once if we are able to work out remote registry or remote event log collection. We do have registry, so we just don't have event log. But if we do figure out remote event log collection or agent-based event log collection at some point, we will be able to model these scenarios as well. But the coercion scenarios are the most kind of abusable, or they are more easily abusable from an attacker standpoint because you don't have to sit on a host and wait periodically for something to log in. You can just force it to happen. And Lee will go into those details now.
So now we're going to dive into each one of those scenarios. So we'll start off talking about the first new edge, which is coerce and relay NTLM to SMB.
Lee, real quick, sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. Is there any way you can turn up your mic? We're getting
Me?
folks ask, if you can be louder.
Let's see.
Or just yell at us.
Is this any better?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Apparently, he was using not my fancy mic, my laptop mic. My bad. All right. So we'll go ahead and kick off using talking about the coerce and relay NTLM to SMB edge. So in this scenario, imagine there's an attacker, and this attacker has compromised a workstation. So just a Windows 11 workstation. And in this scenario, there's 2 computers in the environment where one of the computers has admin rights to another computer. One scenario where this commonly happens is SCCM, I think it's site servers. Oftentimes they have their admin to each other. So the scenario here is just one computer has admin rights. They're in the local administrators group on another computer. And that may sound kind of crazy, but it really does happen more often than you realize inside of environments. So in this scenario, what BloodHound now models is it will detect this new edge here. So coerce and relay NTLM to SMB, and we can see the path. So Win11 is a member of domain computers, which is a member of authenticated users in this domain. And from authenticated users, so any user in the domain can coerce and relay to SMB on SCCM2 in order to get access to that host. There are some restrictions on this. So first of all, is outbound NTLM needs to be enabled on whatever machine we're coercing. So in this case, we're going to coerce SCCM1, but if NTLM is disabled, like outbound NTLM is disabled on this machine, we obviously can't relay that to SCCM2. So if NTLM like the protocol is disabled here, this attack isn't possible, of course. The second requirement is on the target machine, there's a protection that I'll talk about in just a second called SMB signing. And if that's not enabled, then we can abuse this. But if it is enabled, we obviously can't abuse it. And so when we click in on this edge now in BloodHound, it tells us, that we can compromise SCCM2. And then when you click on the edge, it'll tell you the host that I as an attacker should target in order to do this, the coercion. So basically it's telling me I can coerce SCCM1, that server, and then relay it to get access into SCCM2. There's definitely some like operator like trickery that has to go on here. So you have to deal with setting up maybe some tunnels in order to do the relay attack. You may have to like pipe in NTLM relay X, or maybe disable the SMB port on a machine so that you can bind to the SMB protocol and then relay to this target machine. But all of that is surmountable, and an attacker can do it. And so again, ultimately, we're just showing that an authenticated user can get access to this other machine in the network. Something else worth highlighting here, like these new edges work with all the existing pathfinding in BloodHound. So if there's multiple, like longer attack chains will also be surfaced through this. So if SCCM2 has access to other machines and we're doing pathfinding, we can, of course, follow those multi-edge attack paths as well. So this mitigation here, SMB signing. So what is SMB signing? Basically, it's a protection added to the SMB protocol. And it's when you send an SMB negotiate message, the client and the server have to do some negotiation when they're setting up, talking to each other. Part of that is like, maybe what kind of encryption is going to be used. But one of the things that they negotiate is the security mode. And this is what ultimately controls SMB signing. This is a little confusing because SMB signing is different than what's called NTLM signing, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The NTLM protocol has this idea of session security, which deals with signing and sealing. This SMB signing is separate. So instead of being part of the NTLM protocol, this is part of the SMB protocol. So it's the outer layer. And it's ultimately controlled by some registry settings on a host. So if you use group policy, or if you're attacker on a machine, you can query these hosts or query these registry keys to see if SMB signing is enabled. And ultimately, there's this registry key called require security signature. And if that is enabled, then that's going to enforce SMB signing on the host. So if you have admin access to a host, or you can query a host, you can look at these registry values, or there's a lot of tools that allow you to enumerate this unauthenticated. So this is SMB signing, and NTLM relay has been abused for several years. And so there's been several tools written over time to kind of query this information. So Nmap has a scan option for it, and a bunch of these other tools do as well. But ultimately, what they end up checking is during the SMB negotiate message. So that's what we're seeing here. The server responds. So this is a negotiate response. And in that response message, there's this security mode field. And here you can see in this case, signing is enabled, but it's not required. So remember, there's two settings, enabled and required. So signing is supported, but it's not going to be enforced by the server side. So in this case, it is vulnerable, and we can do NTLM relay. So that's the coerce and relay to SMB edge. The next edge we're going to talk about is this coerce and relay NTLM to ADCS edge. Now, a couple of years ago, we came out with support for the ADCS edges in BloodHound. One of the missing edges in there was escalation 8, and that's because it dealt with NTLM relay. And so in this scenario, imagine an attacker compromises, any workstation in the environment. So in this case, we're going to say it's a Windows 7 machine. and the attacker wants to get access to this Windows 11 machine. Maybe there's an IT admin logged in there, or maybe it's a privileged server or something. Well, in order for this scenario to work, there of course needs to be an ADCS server. And on that ADCS server, it's a certificate authority. Inside of BloodHound, you'll now see some new information. You're going to see the HTTP enrollment endpoints. So in this case, we can see there's an enrollment endpoint for HTTP and HTTPS at this URL. And BloodHound is enumerated that sure enough, it is vulnerable. Basically, there's no protections in place to prevent us from relaying to these HTTP endpoints. And so BloodHound's going to construct this path now where, Windows 7, it's a member of the domain computers group. Domain computers is a member of authenticated users. And then this edge, the new edge, coerce and relay NTLM to ADCS, now shows that any user can get access to this Windows 11 machine. So again, the same restriction as before. Whatever host we're coercing, so in this case, this Windows 11 machine, it has to have NTLM enabled so that we can actually abuse this. Another protection that we have to be aware of when modeling this is whether or not the ADCS server has an HTTP endpoint. So if we go back here, we can see there are HTTP endpoints. And if HTTP is enabled, it has to support NTLM. And if HTTPS is enabled, we have to make sure that extended protection for authentication, aka channel binding, is not enabled. If the HTTP endpoint isn't there, or HTTPS is enabled with EPA, so channel binding, we can't abuse this edge. And I'll talk a little bit more about what this is in just 1 second. One of the nice things about this is this looks like a very simple edge. It's just one edge right here. Underneath, what's going on is BloodHound has, if you click on the edge and look at the composition inside of BloodHound, we get all of the nice analysis that comes through the kind of the ADCS hierarchy. So when you click into this, you'll see, okay, our target machine, Windows 11, has enrollment rights. So it needs to be able to enroll in a certificate template. It also does all the checking around, is this a trusted CA? Is it trusted by Active Directory? All of the existing modeling that we did for ADCS is taken into account here. And the path will only show up if all of these other ADCS conditions are met as well. So pretty high accuracy when it comes to actually determining if this is abusable as well. So it's just really nice to see all the work that's going on underneath too to validate that this is a correct edge. I mentioned that if the HTTPS endpoint, so the secure endpoint, is enabled, one thing we have to check for is if extended protection for authentication is enabled. So this is on EPA, or aka channel binding. It's a security feature that basically binds NTLM authentication to the outer protocol. So it's the secure protocol. And this is what it looks like basically went during the NTLM exchange. So there's a new attribute added into the NTLM response from this, basically stating that it requires channel bindings during the authentication. And we can enumerate this, as a low privileged user in the domain as well. So this is, really nice for me as an attacker. I can enumerate this. Very useful from a defensive perspective too, of course, for the same reason. All right. And the final two edges, they're related. So they are the coerce and relay NTLM to LDAP or LDAP-S edges. So in this scenario, we have let's say we have a Windows 11 machine here, and let's say there's a domain controller, and or let's just say there's two domain controllers in this case, and we want to try and compromise one of these domain controllers. Well, there's some conditions that have to be met. First of all, these domain controllers need to have either LDAP or LDAP-S exposed, which of course, since they're domain controllers, it will. And they can't have any of the protections enabled. So LDAP signing or LDAP extended protection for authentication. So if that's the case, what we could do is I, as an attacker, I could target this first domain controller, DC01, coerce it to authenticate to me, the attacker, and then relay it to DC2 to log in as this domain controller. This is what that edge kind of looks like. We're basically going from authenticated users here. So any computer in the domain. Apparently I switched computers without realizing it. But this could be DC, this could be a domain controller, it could be another computer. Basically, it's going from authenticated users, and then we can coerce that machine to authenticate to the other domain controller that doesn't have any of the LDAP protections. Again, the same restriction needs to, NTLM needs to be enabled on whatever machine we're targeting. So like that DC that we're trying to go after. This also has another condition where the web client service needs to be running on the target machine. And that's because when we do the coercion, we're actually coercing HTTP authentication from whatever our target machine is. Most of the time, the web client won't be running on servers. It's a separate server role, but we have seen several servers that do have it running. But we see it quite often being enabled on workstation machines. So it's installed by default on Windows workstations. And when you access WebDAV shares, so a lot of times this happens when you're using like SharePoint. When you access these WebDAV shares, it turns the web client service on and makes this attack path possible, allows us to relay to LDAP. And in terms of requirements on this target machine, if LDAP is enabled, then it can't have signing. So, and if LDAP-S is enabled, then we need to check and make sure that EPA is enforced, so channel binding is enabled, and that LDAP signing has been enabled or disabled as well. There is a way that if LDAP-S is enabled and channel binding is enabled, if you can relay basically from LDAP and then upgrade to LDAP-S. There was some really good research done by Almond Consulting that showed that you can upgrade from relaying to LDAP to an LDAP-S connection. And by doing that, you can get access to some additional attack techniques. So like you can do like password resets or some other LDAP operations that you're typically not allowed to. The mitigation for this is to, one, enable LDAP signing, and then also to enable, for LDAP-S, to enable channel binding. And, you know, before we talked about SMB signing, that was at the SMB protocol layer. In this case, when we're talking about LDAP signing, this is actually happening in the NTLM authentication and messages that are sent back and forth. So this is at the NTLM level. And so here you can see, you know, in this case, the signing bit is set. And so in this case, we can see that we can't actually abuse it because it's enforced on LDAP at least. So these are the 4 edges. I'll turn it over to Justin to talk about what we've seen now in some of in the real world.
Yeah. So next slide. We've had this in early access for, I guess, a little over a month now. This is actually going generally available next week in both BloodHound CE and BloodHound Enterprise. If you want to use it before then, you have to go to the administration and then go on early access features and then toggle it on. But we've already seen some pretty big impact. So Again, NTLM has been used to abuse systems without needing the password. That's kind of like a big deal for us. We don't actually need the password, and abusing has session edges is kind of the same scenario there. We don't actually need the password. So a lot of people focus on hardening the passwords, but there's an additional risk that we want to highlight here. It allows people to move laterally with minimal footprint, as Lee mentioned, or Lee showed earlier. Case in point, like we have BloodHound Enterprise customers that would do really good work in locking down attack paths, and then our consulting team would come in and then relay. And we never had the ability to see these before. So it was really frustrating, and we wanted to build support for this. Because again, on the consulting side, if they relayed, they would show the client how to fix it, and that didn't mean go ahead and cripple your environment by disabling NTLM org-wide. They were giving very targeted remediation. So that's kind of the reason why we wanted to do it. So again, you can gain control of critical systems like Lee mentioned, and bypassing those traditional security controls, like again, like vaulting and stuff. Not that you shouldn't use vaulting or stuff like that. It's just that this kind of is another opportunity that we use all the time on the consulting side. And what we saw in the industry was a bunch of products were um, detecting if NTLM was enabled at the domain level, and then recommending people disable this at the domain level. But we knew that people couldn't do that. Again, like you'll have legacy systems that you have to keep up and running, and we understand that. So, something that we've already seen, we knew that this was bad because authenticated users, so when NTL, like these relay attacks are available, and you'll see this in BloodHound, when they're available, that means that authenticated users or any authenticated principal in the forest can use this. What that means is the amount of people that can use this edge is very, very large. And so we saw just a huge spike in attack paths in a lot of environments. What you're seeing here is in the count of unique attack paths in an environment, and you just see up and to the right, which is we don't want to see that. We want to see that go down. We see this quite a lot when we add new tradecraft into BloodHound, but the good thing is we can also see this over time as people remediate it. Again, why we built it, visualize what you haven't been able to see before. The attackers knew that they could do this. We try to get a little bit more specific on where those opportunities are. Next one. The other thing is, by visualizing the specific attack paths, you can actually categorize the risk involved in those configurations. It's not just like NTLM is bad and we should disable it because attackers use it. We can get really specific. They can use it here, and this is what they could do by coercing and relaying and abusing those edges. You can also prioritize, right? So like not everything is going to be equal. If you coerce and relay to a server that really, I mean, ultimately you would want to prevent all of it, but maybe you want to start at the DC, like make sure people can't take over the domain controller and then work your way down. The super cool thing here is, again, we give you multiple ways you can fix it. First, yes, you can disable it domain-wide if you're in one of those organizations that can do that, but you can also disable it at the host level or at the protocol level. So you can preserve the legacy communications for NTLM if you have those systems that must use that, but you can remove our ability from the attacker's perspective to relay against that host. And then again, I mean, on the BloodHound Enterprise side, you can just see how you're improving over time. Or on the BloodHound Community Edition, you can verify that you removed that edge.
Awesome. So just to kind of close things out, some of the things that, this kind of enables us going into the future, we can potentially expand this beyond coerced computer authentication. Will kind of alluded to that already. Maybe there's network scanner accounts or users authenticating in that we could potentially add in and model this. This also allows us to, get some good data around, how NTLM is being protected against, like the defenses around NTLM are being used. Over the years, there's a lot of ways you can address these vulnerabilities. And so what I'm excited to see too is kind of the most effective way organizations choose to defend against this. So we're going to be able to get data around that too over time as people start mitigating this. Maybe in the future, IA curb once NTLM is disabled, maybe this won't be a problem. So maybe that'll happen in the future, but we're still kind of waiting for that to get released. So looking forward to that actually happening. And we definitely highly recommend that people go and check out Elad Shamir's in-depth blog post about NTLM and NTLM relay attacks. He released it the other week, and we'll have a link to it right here that you can go and check out. He does an extremely good job explaining it, much better than we could cover in here, and a lot more detail. It is the best reference I've seen around NTLM and NTLM relay attacks out there. So, and also just as a kind of a shout out, we are going to be at RSA in case anybody wants to come and say hi to a bunch of the team. We're going to be hanging out at booth 349. So feel free to come and say hi and maybe share your experience so far with trying to deal with some of these attacks.
Yeah. And we will have Elad Shamir built it's kind of like a BloodHound folk-based like tower defense type game that we're going to have interactive there at RSA so people can play it.
So we have a bunch of questions already. If folks have questions, please throw them in the chat. First is, will the slides be made available? Yes, we will share those. And then a whole bunch of questions about protected users. So Lee, Will, if you guys want to take a look at that.
Yeah, let's see. So, all right. So protected users group. Yep. Yeah. If you have users or computers in the protected users group, it will protect against this because users in the protected users group can't use NTLM. It's disabled for them. So that's definitely a really good mitigation.
And we do model that correctly,
Yeah.
or we do handle that. Yeah. So that is, it wasn't kind of like glossed over. There's a lot of different details and subtleties and stuff that were put into the effort that we didn't have time to cover.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you see the edge basically in BloodHound, that means that it's valid. Like we're taking into account, like you shouldn't see a user that's in the protected users group be susceptible to this.
Yep. Let's see. I had a question about, could this be used to potentially help uncover other NTLM related vulnerabilities?
We focused maybe,
Yeah.
but in general, we kind of put vulns and NTLM and everything out of scope for the general efforts that we were doing. So a lot of all these three scenarios that Lee detailed, these aren't like vulnerabilities, they're misconfigurations, which tends to be kind of the wheelhouse for BloodHound. So we're not like dissecting stuff at the protocol level or something that, I don't know, maybe there's some particular edge cases that you can maybe relay edges pop up and that maybe that, uncovers some like subtleties for something that shouldn't have been applied. But in general, it's not going to be a tool for uncovering like new CVEs or, vulns like that for NTLM. That's more kind of the realm of a traditional like vulnerability management solution, as mentioned.
There was a question about computers in the protected users group. Do you think you answered that, Lee?
That should work as well. Maybe Rohan, I think you implemented this. So
we did actually model that. So if computers are in the protected users group and the domain functional level is past 2012, we will actually exclude those from targets for coercion.
There's a question of this releases this week. It's been in early access for about a month, but it will go generally available. What early access means is like anybody with BloodHound today can just toggle on the thing and then use some early access features. But like it'll go out whether or not you toggle that next week because we'll just be a part of the product.
That's in the administration settings if you go there.
Yeah.
You can also get back button support there right now. It's also in early access.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
That's back button is something that people have wanted for quite some time. That's coming. That's been in BloodHound CE for 3 or 4 weeks now. It's going into enterprise next week. It's just more complex because there's more application to deal with. So we're excited about that. And that will be generally available very shortly after that. We just want to make sure that we catch any random edge cases, but pretty highly confident on that.
With the question about, I have no idea where to start disabling NTLM, very little support. If you had to pick one or top 3 plays start disabling NTLM, what would those be? Honestly, I mean, my suggestion would be like even flipping on the early access, like doing a collection for your environment, and then there's remediation guidance on like the Bloodhound side. So it'll show you the very specific sections and very specific places that allow at least the coercion scenarios that we're talking about. Right, Justin, along with like it'll try to give you guidance to
Yep.
where exactly kind of disable very particular things without having to say, let me just disable it enterprise wide or something like that.
I want to be clear too that like the best mitigations for this is to either enable signing, whether that's LDAP signing or SMB signing, and to enable channel binding or extended protection for authentication. So those are the priorities. Like if you can enable those on LDAP, enable them on your ADCS systems. These are things that control authentication. That's a good spot to start if you can try and enable them there. And then enabling, a lot of times we see the group policy for SMB signing being pushed out. And the reason why I emphasize on kind of those mitigations a little bit too is because there are other things that, other relay attacks that we hope to be able to model in the future. So you may have heard of like Kerberos relaying. By implementing those mitigations in addition to, or by enabling signing and channel binding, you also address those forms of relaying attacks as well.
So like hopefully, Evan, that answered your question on where to start. But like maybe if you're not getting support, just foot stomping what Will said is like if you are able to use Bloodhound, CE or Enterprise internally to explain the risk of this. Like again, the NTLM bad, attackers use it bad. Like that may not resonate, but if you can literally show the path and what people could do with it, that might help at least get support, and then you can be really specific on channel binding and EPA. When are we getting NTLM dog and doghouse stickers? Yeah, I actually just asked that. A lot of people have been giving good comments on that. I would say I would. There's probably no way we can get those out before RSA, but maybe come catch us at an event and then over the next couple months, and we'll probably have them ready.
Had a question about needing like a man in the middle in order to do this. And if we're aware of any Active Directory proxies or, something of a kind of in that realm of how they isolate the network traffic that could, maybe be used to mitigate this. I'm unaware of anything like that would really solve this. You can use like host-based firewalls as well to restrict outbound connections from a host to help mitigate the authentication coercion component of this. But we rarely see host-based firewalls being used as a solid mitigation inside of enterprises for whatever, like they've traditionally been pretty hard to manage. And so we haven't seen that used as a good mitigation for this yet. And a question, is there any way to mitigate authentication coercion attacks? So if relaying is not possible, but coercion is, what do you think about the impact? So authentication coercion attacks, they're kind of tricky to deal with. I would say, again, if you can enable the mitigations, so signing and channel binding, then that's going to mitigate the risk associated with those. Like ultimately, if you can do coercion, but you can't relay, like it's not useful for anything. So that's one aspect of it. I would also say, network segmentation will also help out here. So host-based firewalls, network firewalls, just to prevent the outbound connection attempts is another effective way to deal with authentication coercion. I'm always hesitant to recommend using like RPC filters. Some people have brought this up as a potential mitigation, as like using RPC filters in the through the Windows firewall, or there's some tools that have been released. I think there's one called like the RPC firewall, but it requires adding hooks into a bunch of Microsoft processes, which again, it's a little more less supported in my opinion. So I'm hesitant to recommend that for any sort of enterprise scenario. So I'd say focus on the mitigations for the attacks, and then you're going to deal with that'll ultimately solve the coercion problems.
I mean, we also had, remember, Lee, the original reason that you came up with, or the original abuse of the coercion attacks is for unconstrained delegation systems, which are obviously already modeled in BloodHound. But that was, you know, the very first way that we would abuse these attacks in a programmatic way on security assessments, is coercing like a DC to connect to a system if you had control of an unconstrained delegation system, extracting the DC's TGT and then abusing that kind of thing. So there, NTLM is probably the most prolific issue with these coercion primitives, but I would imagine that in the future there might be other things that come out as well. So
Somebody asked, is there an alternative to using SharpHound for data collection? We are working on multiple different ways, if you're a BloodHound Enterprise customer, to pull data out of systems with different integrations. So hopefully more to follow in the summer-ish timeframe. But this, hopefully using SharpHound to collect this isn't too big of an issue for folks, because again, you don't have to give SharpHound any privilege to collect this. So, as of Windows 16.07 and above, you needed admin rights to collect things like user sessions and local groups. But this you can just collect as a low privilege user. So hopefully this doesn't increase a barrier of getting access to this data using traditional SharpHound. But yes, we are working on different ways to collect information. And I say ways for a reason. There's multiple different paths because people have different conflicting factors or issues with different scenarios. So we're gonna hopefully have a whole bunch of different options that we can talk about later this summer.
yeah, and specifically with some of the like the signing stuff, rightly, like there's in order to collect all the information needed to model all these relay scenarios, it extends beyond just like LDAP. So you actually need to be able to, check, over the SMB protocol and LDAP and things like that. So I imagine that someone is probably going to implement something like this in like all the components are there for Python or whatever else. So I'm sure there'll probably be like some extension to some community-based collectors over time, but we're just focused primarily on the SharpHound side for us. And saying I'm not familiar with that. The other question from Jesse saying maybe this is a firewall for LDAP to mitigate. We just haven't investigated that specifically. So that's something we'll put on our list to check out. But I don't think you're not familiar with the project, are you, Lee, for from Zero Networks?
Not.
Yeah. But that's something we can investigate and kind of follow up on.
There's a question about Bloodhound Pi, which actually was funny. Bishop Fox recently named Bloodhound Python as like the winner of like Red Team Tools and gave us a shout out. That's actually maintained by Dirkjan from a different company. I'm blanking. Somebody jump in with his company name. But Dirkjan maintains that. He may or may not add that. It'd probably be a question for him. But he's pretty quick on most things. So
I imagine it'll be added fairly soon. It's just a new feature, so
yeah,
I think it just takes a little bit of time.
Yeah, so if you're using like AD Explorer to do an AD dump and a Python script, be able to scrape that stuff in, that won't work across the board for these NTLM relay scenarios, rightly, in that you don't get that protocol level, is signing enabled, is this enabled? Like you might be able to define some of those things from like unrolling GPO stuff, but it's not, I believe there's some of the primitives for these relay edges that you won't be able to collect from like a pure LDAP standpoint.
Yeah. So some people have mentioned potentially doing the collection using GPOs. We just haven't added that in. So PRs are welcome. If anybody would like to add that in, and that may be able to help address some of that. But
plug for next week, actually. A lot of people have been asking for a while. The local group collection through GPOs has not been supported in Bloodhound CE. That is actually going out next week. So I'm pretty excited to put that back on there.
Sweet.
I think we're it for questions.
Great. Well, feel free to reach out to any of us if there are additional questions. Feel free to email us. You can also find most of us on Twitter, and we're always happy to chat. So feel free to reach out. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. See you later.